August 20th, 2022, and welcome everybody to the New Mexico State Game Commission with the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. Can you all hear me
Fairly well.
fairly well?
Just
Fairly well.
closer if you can.
I have a chocolate running.
Priority.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So welcome. We're here in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the Department of Game and Fish, and it's a beautiful place, and it's wonderful to see all of you that are present here today. So let us get started. This meeting is called to order. Director, can we please have a roll call? Go. Roll call.
Commissioner Salazar Henry. I don't know if she's jumped on virtually yet. or-
Not jumped on.
Not yet.
Let me-
Commissioner Lopez.
Here.
Commissioner Volkman.
Here.
Vice Chair Gilletta.
Here,
Chair Salazar Hickey.
here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, sir. All right, well, another favorite part of the day is introduction of guests. Today we'll go from to my left and just around the room. My name is Sharon Salazar Hickey. I'm the chair of the State Game Commission.
Dean Archuleta, I'm the vice chair.
Teresa Lopez, State Game Commissioner.
Ryan Dar, Assistant Chief of Information with Game and Fish. And would we like to introduce now our virtual attendees?
Please, that would be great.
First, we have Ann. Ann, would you like to introduce yourself? Okay, Ann, would you introduce yourself?
Try it again. Yeah, Ann Forston with the Wildlife Management Institute.
Thank you, Ann. And next we have Chris Smith. Chris, would you introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Chris Smith. I'm the Western Field Representative for the Wildlife Management Institute, and I'm in Helena, Montana.
Thank you, Chris. And we have Elena. Elena, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Elena Takaki, and I work at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies.
Thank you, Elena. Now we have Mark. Mark, will you please introduce yourself?
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the commission, guests and staff. My name is Mark Matini. I live in Pewate Village, Laguna Pueblo, Cibola County, and I represent only myself. Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you, Mark. And finally, we have Scott. Well, Scott, it's telling us you have an older version of Zoom and you're not allowed to talk. So I guess you have to update.
If he wants to type in the chat, we can read his introduction for him.
Yeah, it's Scott. If you'll type your information in the chat, we'll introduce you. Thank you.
While he's doing that, Madam Chair, members of the commission, I'm Tristana Bickford. I'm the department's Assistant Chief of Education.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, I'm Darren Vaughn, the editor and translator for the department.
Good morning, I'm Gavin Lujan. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the agency.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, my name is Paul Vella, I'm the Chief of Administrative Services.
Good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. I'm Kirk Patton, Chief of Fisheries for the department.
Morning, Madam Chair, Commissioners, Matt Wonder, Chief of Ecological Environmental Planning Division.
Madam Chair, members of the Commission, Lauren Patterson, President of the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the commission. I'm Tim Single, Colonel over Field Operations for that game.
Morning, Madam Chair, Commission, Department staff, like heroes. My name is Brandon Nguyen. I'm an Albuquerque citizen, just here as a citizen in New Mexico.
Morning, Madam Chair, Commission, James Pittman, I'm the Chief of the Information and Education Division for the department.
Morning, Madam Chair, Commissioners, members of the public, Mr. Nguyen, Mr. Patterson, Ross Morgan, Public Information Officer.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Commissioners, members of the public, Jennifer Morgan, Hunter Education Coordinator.
Morning, everyone. Mike Sloan, Director of the agency.
Good morning, Greg Wolford, Gal. Glad to be here.
Very good.
Okay.
What-
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but we do have Scott Lyric, sportsman from Carlsbad.
Okay, very good. And if anyone jumps in at any point, Ryan or Tristana, could you please interrupt or get my attention and let us know that we have someone else who has joined us. I understand that there may be technical difficulties at other ends, so we welcome everybody to our meeting. And so let's get started. It's a wonderful day here. We have a brief agenda today. It's a half a day. It's a special meeting. A special meeting because our focus is to learn from others. So there's not necessarily public comment as we normally do with our regular meetings, our rulemaking meetings. But this special meeting, when I say we learn from others, is that we have special guests that are going to be very informative. We will be taking breaks. I would like to take breaks after every presentation. A number of people have made a point to come here today, and I'd like to be able to engage and have those private discussions with the staff and with persons present. Just again, during the break, just to have informal discussions. I think it would be very healthy and good communications. So that's a good lead into agenda item number 4, which is the approval of our agenda. Now, yesterday, we had a full day in Gallup, New Mexico. Beautiful place. We were unable to complete one of the agenda items. We couldn't even tackle it. And that was the executive session to discuss section 10-15-1H8, New Mexico State Statutes annotated 1978, the purchase, acquisition, and or disposal of 2 properties, one in Rio Reba County, Humphreys WMA, and 2 Santa Fe County disposition of Richards Avenue property in Santa Fe. And then secondly, we were going to discuss section 10-15-1H2 NMSA 1978 personnel matters. So commissioners, department, and members of the public, I would like to suggest that we add that executive session to the end of our day, which would follow Dr. Deb Dow Hammond, item number 8 on the agenda. And for those of you that are at your computers, you will know, and you can follow along with my description of the agenda. It's posted on the department's website under commissions, commission meetings, and agendas. But I would like to add the executive session under item number 8. I understand that one of our commissioners, Roberta Salazar Henry, would like to join us. She's not on at this time, but she may join us later in the meeting. And for the record, I'd like to be able to add her. So that's some discussion. I think we can get through the day by noon. If not 12:30-ish, 1 o'clock maybe, even adding the executive session. What do you think? Commissioners, thoughts, discussions?
I just wanted to make one clarification point. Commissioner Salazar Henry is not able to join us this morning due to a personal matter, but will try to join us when during Deb's presentation, so I just wanted to make sure that's new. But other than that, Madam Chair, I think that's a great plan. I fully support it.
Okay, well then in that case, this is an action item. And I would like to take a vote. Mr. Secretary, Director Sloan, I think it's okay to do a roll, just a vote.
Madam Chair, I think since we don't have anybody on, no commissioners online, I think a voice vote would be fine. I think we do need a motion and a second though.
Oh, of course, but I'm just warned for me. So my motion is to hereby amend today's agenda, adding another item after 8 and have an executive session that would include A, pursuant to section 10-15-1H8 NMSA 1978, purchase, acquisition, or disposal of Rio Arriba County record number 22-203 Humphreys WMA, Santa Fe County record number 22-202, disposition of Richards Avenue property, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and pursuant to section 10-15-1H2 NMSA 1978, personnel matters, records numbers 22-301 and 22-302 to today's agenda item. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Question.
Question.
I'm sorry, I did.
I just wanted to clarify that now we're doing this, we can do this with you, as long as we don't take action. Is that what we're doing?
Thank you, Commissioner Fulfer. That was a very important point at yesterday's meeting with our Attorney General present. And I did clarify that the executive session would not have action at all. It's just purely discussion. So, Director, I'm adding that to my motion, clarifying that the executive session has no action.
So, Madam Chair, just to summarize, you're moving to approve the agenda with the addition of an executive session out of which there will be no action.
Beautiful. Yes. And I have a second to that. Any other questions? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Awesome. Let us move on to our agenda item number 5. Director, we're looking forward, and we have some wonderful guests with us today for these next 3 agenda items. First one is the video of John Organ, the North American model of wildlife conservation origins, meaning and purpose. We'd love to hear.
Madam Chair, if I may just read a quick biography of Dr. Organ, so you get a sense of why we selected him. And unfortunately, he was unable to appear in person, but he did recommend this video, and I think it does an excellent job of explaining the North American model. But Dr. John Organ is a scientist emeritus with the U.S. Geological Survey. From 2014 to 2019, he was the chief of the USGS Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Units Program. Prior to that, he was chief of wildlife and sport fish restoration for the Northeast region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a cooperative program between the service and state fish and wildlife agencies. His research efforts focus on wildlife conservation issues that involve multiple agencies and stakeholders in achieving solutions to conservation challenges. He's particularly interested in contributing to a knowledge base that will help us understand what actions will be required to maintain viable populations of mammal species while minimizing conflicts with humans. He's also interested in the long-term implications of changing human demographics to the future of wildlife conservation in North and South America. He's on the faculty of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and the Universidad Andrés Bello in Santiago, Chile, as well as Michigan State. And I guess important to this particular discussion is he was one of 2 original authors of the paper that proposed and created the North American model. So I think we can consider him an expert in the area.
And thank you all for having me spend some time with you today. My good friend Scott asked me if I would give a talk in the North American model of wildlife conservation. Since the time when Val Geist, Shane Mahoney, and I first published the first definitive paper on this concept 20 years ago, my experience has been that if you ask 10 different wildlife professionals what the North American model of wildlife conservation is, you will get 10 different answers. That's why I chose today to talk about the origins, the meaning, and the purpose of the North American model. Oops. Why isn't that? Let me see if this will work. I've got my first technical issue here. Let me see if this. There we go.
It does eventually.
I had to find the right button to push to advance the slides. Zoom. Well, the North American model of wildlife conservation is a concept that was first articulated by Dr. Valerius Geist, who's Professor Emeritus of Environmental Science at the University of Calgary, and quite frankly, one of the most eminent wildlife biologists in the history of our short profession. Geist was born in Eastern Europe and lived under two different totalitarian regimes before emigrating to Canada as a young man. His PhD research on mountain sheep at the University of British Columbia under Ian McTaggart Cowan resulted in a classic book that won the Wildlife Society Book Award of the Year in 1971. Having experienced how wildlife issues were governed under different regimes around the world, he observed that the United States and Canada had legal and policy initiatives that in combination made wildlife conservation in North America unique. He began to articulate these principles or tenets, calling them a model or example. In collaboration with Shane Mahoney and myself, 7 legal and policy tenets were first published in 2001 as the North American model of wildlife conservation. The references I've listed here are the ones that I believe are really the critical resources for those interested in fully understanding the basis for the North American model of wildlife conservation. The one at the top is from the Boone and Crockett Club's 2018 tome on North American wildlife policy and law, and I highly recommend that entire volume. And even though I'm obviously biased, I think that chapter is as definitive a treatment of the model as has been presented. These bullets represent what I believe are the key premises that are related to the North American model. These are that as wildlife conservation emerged in North America, a distinct form developed. And that emergence really began in the mid-19th century. The 7 components, tenets, or principles are not all unique to North America, but their collective association is. And the North American model is not prescriptive like a scientific or statistical model. The term model here is really intended to mean example. And its purpose is not to outline every conservation strategy and mechanistic approach, but only to highlight those legal and policy underpinnings, and I really emphasize legal and policy, that collectively make North American conservation unique. At this point, it's important to articulate certain precepts that underlie North American wildlife conservation. Wildlife has value when it's alive. The uncontrolled use of wildlife leading to decline and extinction is unacceptable. Wildlife is a public resource. And the responsibility of government is to conserve for current and future generations. And some wildlife can be perpetuated with sustainable use. But sustainable use is a principle that is recognized globally and sanctioned by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. But for sustainable use to be accepted in contemporary society, it must adhere to certain principles. These three have been articulated previously. That's that the use must serve a practical purpose, and that the species or population being utilized is not threatened or endangered. And if that use requires take, that method of take is considered acceptable. So these are the 7 tenets of the North American model of wildlife conservation. I'll describe each in greater detail, but it's important to note that these are not intended to represent the entire suite of conservation approaches in North America. These represent those with broad-based underlying legal and policy foundations that collectively make North American wildlife conservation unique and distinct from other forms worldwide. The model is not game-centric or focused on hunting, but these tenets have each been applied more so to game species, principally because that's where the bulk of conservation funding has been directed towards. Recently, greater emphasis has been placed on applying these principles to other taxa such as herpetofauna. I believe an achievement of this century will be application as appropriate of these principles to all taxa. The first tenet is really the keystone. Wildlife is a public trust resource. The public trust doctrine is, in fact, a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that was issued in 1842. The case that came before Chief Justice Roger Taney, Martin versus Waddell, involved the landowner's claim to rights over oyster beds near the waterline of his property on the Raritan River in New Jersey. The landowner claimed exclusive right to the fishery based on the grant of land to his ancestors in the 1660s by King Charles II of England. In researching the legal basis for such a claim, Taney went back to the Magna Carta to see whether the king had the power to convey such a right. The Magna Carta, in turn, had drawn from ancient Roman law, first articulated in the 2nd century AD under the Emperor Gaius, and first written in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. Many scholars believe the concept of ownerless things, such as wild animals, dates back to ancient Greek Hellenic law. Indeed, it's, in my opinion anyway, it's likely that the first humans held the notion that wild things could be owned by no one. What Taney discovered is that under English common law, there are special kinds of property, and the English disdained the concept of ownerless things. So these special kinds of property were held in trust by the king for the benefit of his subjects, not for his personal use. The king in this sense is a trustee, owning property for others and having special responsibilities that come with such trust. Now, the ancient Romans did not define who the trustee was, but the English conveyed this responsibility to the king. Now, much of the current United States, particularly in the West, was derived from Spanish land grants. So it's useful to see how ownership of wild resources were addressed by the Spaniards. If you look back at the origins of Spanish and Mexican land grants, they placed ownership of wild resources in the trusteeship of the territorial governor. In America, the 13 original colonies were under English law, and the king was trustee. After independence, there was no king, and trusteeship was not defined. Chief Justice Taney, a staunch states' rights advocate, placed trusteeship in the individual states in his landmark decision in Martin versus Waddell. And this, of course, has become known as the public trust doctrine. In so doing, He declined the landowner's claim to exclusive rights to the oyster fishery. Tawney added a caveat, though. He stated that the federal government could exert ownership if the Constitution provided such powers. 3 clauses of the U.S. Constitution allow for federal trusteeship of wildlife resources: Commerce Clause, Property Clause, and the Supremacy Clause. The Commerce Clause gives the federal government authority to regulate interstate commerce and is the legal foundation for the Lacey Act, the most important anti-poaching law in the United States. It also provides legal authority in part for the Endangered Species Act. The Property Clause gives the federal government ownership of resources on federal lands. This clause is broadly written and arbitrarily written, and federal authority over wildlife on federal lands continues to be contested by many states. The Supremacy Clause mandates that federal treaties are supreme law of the land. The 1916 Migratory Bird Treaty between the United States and Great Britain on behalf of Canada became the constitutional grounding for the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This federal authority was contested in a 1920 Supreme Court case titled Missouri versus Ray P. Holland. Ray P. Holland was a federal game warden who arrested the Attorney General of Missouri for hunting waterfowl outside of the federal season framework. This test case affirmed federal authority over migratory birds vis-a-vis the 1916 treaty and the Supremacy Clause. Likewise, the treaty known as CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, provided constitutional basis for the Endangered Species Act. Chief Justice Tawney, in his decision, did not explicitly address wildlife, but it was assumed the broad language encompassed it. A subsequent Supreme Court decision in 1896 in the case Geer versus Connecticut explicitly placed wildlife in the public trust. Today, public ownership of wildlife is entrusted to state fish and wildlife agencies as trust managers, with limited federal ownership managed by agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. The preeminent scholar of the public trust doctrine, Joseph Sachs, outlines certain conditions that must be held true for the public trust to be viable. Under trust law, trust resources must be considered property. It is noteworthy that animal rights ideology rejects the notion of animals as property. And it begs the question, if animal rights became law, would public ownership, and by default, the government's ability to regulate and protect wildlife, have no legal foundation? Trust resources must be available for general use of the public, unless conserving the corpus of the trust requires restrictions. And the notion of public trust applies to traditional uses such as recreation and fisheries. It also applies to what Sachs defined as natural uses that are peculiar to that resource. Hunting game, for example, could be construed as such a natural use. Sachs stated that the free availability of such natural uses defined a civilization as one of citizens rather than serfs. Further scholarship has suggested that certain other conditions must prevail in order for public trust to be viable. The public needs to be aware of their rights, and they must be able to enforce it against mismanagement by the government. Also, they must be consistent with contemporary concerns. The ancient Romans likely could have appreciated my colleague and TWS past president John McDonnell's desire to legally pursue and take a white-tailed buck in photo. They may not have comprehended our concern to protect the endangered carnival butterfly. The public trust doctrine has not held up as an impenetrable fortress in case law. In some instances, the courts have ruled in favor of general public interest, such as economic concerns, and not recognized the greater obligation that comes with trusteeship. It raises a concern as to whether the public trust doctrine is indeed a judicially enforceable right. Some of the challenges we observe to public ownership of wildlife include inappropriate claims of ownership, such as deer behind high fences, unregulated sale of live wildlife, as is rampant with reptiles, difficulties in access to public resources, largely due to private property rights and access fees. As mentioned earlier, a value system endorsing animal rights that could theoretically remove their status as property and therefore trust resources. The second tenet is the elimination of markets for game. This represented one of the earliest crusades in the ancestral wildlife conservation movement of the mid-19th century. The New York Association for the Protection of Game, co-founded by Theodore Roosevelt's uncle Robert, made it its primary duty to pass local laws prohibiting the sale of game and making citizen arrests for violations. Members of the Boone and Crockett Club, particularly co-founder George Bird Grinnell, waged a blistering campaign against market hunting and were responsible for the passage of the Lacey Act. What Garrett Harding would later term the tragedy of the commons was in full force, as unregulated hunting of game for markets was rapidly depleting wildlife. When markets placed value on dead wildlife was produced. Sport hunting, or hunting under conditions of fair play, termed fair chase, placed value on wildlife when alive, and the belief was that it would produce live wildlife. Fur bearers, not considered game at the time, were still trapped for the fur market, but restrictions on trap devices and imposition of seasons and bag limits regulated the take, which was considered beneficial in reducing conflicts with humans. However, until recently, there's been little legal restrictions for markets on certain other taxes, such as reptiles. This internet advertisement indicates shopping for turtles is easy. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates of the number of turtles exported from the United States during a 5-year period in the late 2000s were in the billions. Agencies and conservation organizations, mindful of the success of the elimination of markets for game, have been tightening regulations to restrict what appears to be an unsustainable market. Concern has also been raised over certain commercial contests for, say, shooting the largest coyote or some similar effort. Does this represent a market approach? These contests, I think, as many of you are aware, have received much criticism in public discourse. In recent years, some have advocated highly regulated markets as a way to control overabundant game species such as white-tailed deer in some urban and suburban settings. In fact, the opening of markets for the meat and hides of American alligators was critical in restoring the population and removing it from the endangered species list. Establishing highly regulated markets for game in certain areas could potentially reduce conflicts, could also cultivate an appreciation for wolf hunters, and ready access to local healthy meat by non-hunters could foster an appreciation for animals they view as pests. However, this is a slippery slope, and any effort to open up markets for game must have a preeminent and overriding conservation purpose to be considered as a last resort. The third tenet is allocation of wildlife by law. This represents the fact that wildlife in the United States and Canada is not allocated based on markets, birthright, land ownership, or other special privilege. Enactment of laws pertaining to wildlife is a process that's open to public discourse. Concern has been raised that even though we have many laws and regulations pertaining to wildlife, court-imposed penalties for violators don't often measure to the crime, as judges who deal regularly with crimes against other humans may tend to devalue wildlife in comparison. Protections enacted by law for the benefit of wildlife may be negated by land use decisions that aren't under the jurisdiction of wildlife agencies, thereby negating the impact of such protections. The fourth tenet is that wildlife can only be killed for legitimate purpose. For hunting and trapping, laws define what species and under what conditions wildlife can be taken. Wanton waste laws in many states require hunters to utilize the meat. For most other wildlife, laws or regulations specify when and where and what permissions apply to the killing of wildlife. Typically, this involves self-defense and property protection, and more recently, culling for the purpose of disease control, as is in chronic wasting disease, for example. In some cases, we have seen activities that on their face violate this tenet. Examples include rattlesnake roundups and long-range rifle shootings with prairie dogs as targets. It's difficult to identify a conservation purpose aligned with these activities. In recent years, we've seen a reduction in sanctioning of rattlesnake roundups, and I think this bodes well for the conservation of the species. The fifth tenet is wildlife is considered an international resource. Grounded in international treaty, this tenet recognizes that wildlife can transcend borders and one nation's actions can impact the other's resources. Examples include the Migratory Bird Treaty of 1916, championed by Canadian C. Gordon Hewitt, among others, and CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Current issues germane to this tenet include climate change, where international cooperation will be essential in facilitating adaptive strategies of species impacted where range shifts across borders may occur. Border walls may threaten the viability of populations of certain species whose range periphery crosses a border, essentially isolating population segments and subjecting them to reduced gene flow and lowered viability. The sixth tenet is science is the proper tool for discharging wildlife policy. Aldo Leopold articulated this tenet in his classic textbook, Game Management, published in 1933, which no doubt is familiar to everyone in Wisconsin. He referenced this as part of what he termed the Roosevelt Doctrine, reflecting the impact President Theodore Roosevelt had on wildlife conservation. All who have been involved in developing policy recognize that science is not the only one factor that goes into policy decision making. Policy development is part of the political process. It involves consideration of public input, economics, pragmatics, and other factors. The challenge we face today is ensuring that science does in fact play a role in decision making. However, the thrust of this tenet is that once policy has been established, wildlife professionals will implement, that is, discharge it using the best available science. That science should incorporate both ecological and social sciences. Social science and wildlife policies become increasingly important as changes in society have rejected, in many cases, the expert authority model that the wildlife professionals founded on. The model's operating premise is that trained technical elites know what is best for society. Bernard Fernot and Gifford Pinchot, both disciples of the Prussian forestry system, were weaned on this concept. Social differentiation in the 1960s and the rise of the cult of the individual, as sociologists termed it, demanded a stronger public voice in decision making. The advent of the discipline of human dimensions of wildlife and its role in providing knowledge to decision makers as to attitudes, basic beliefs, and needs of the beneficiaries of public trust promise to achieve more durable science-informed decisions in the future. The seventh and final tenet is democracy of hunting. Recall that the purpose of the North American model is to identify those key legal and policy initiatives that collectively distinguish wildlife conservation in the United States and Canada from other forms worldwide. Both Theodore Roosevelt and Aldo Leopold wrote that, quote, democracy of sport, where every citizen had the privilege to hunt, distinguished wildlife conservation in America from that in Europe. Current challenges to this tenet include reduced access to land, an increase in fee-based hunting that may favor the wealthy, and shrinking societal support for hunting. I'd like to turn now to some of the broader issues and criticism of the model. Many have criticized the model as being hunting-centric and merely an effort to justify hunting. In fact, all the tenets except the last one are much broader than hunting. The reality is that application of these tenets has largely been focused on game species, because the full bulk of conservation funding at the state level has been generated by hunters. As we meet here today, legislative efforts are underway that will provide broad-based funding that would greatly enhance the ability of wildlife trustees to apply these tenets to all taxes. And I'm referring, of course, to the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's worth revisiting the topic of wildlife markets. It has generated much discussion. Scott and I have had many discussions over this issue. As stated earlier, there are potential positive outcomes of highly regulated markets for game meat. However, markets really should remain the exception and be warranted only where there is a true conservation benefit that otherwise could not be achieved. Many have criticized the model for being mute on habitat conservation initiatives. The model's tenets reflect principles enacted into law or policy, and to date, there are no overarching legal measures for wildlife habitat protection. There are many piecemeal efforts at the state and national levels, but no consistent policy that governs land use. Although Leopold stated that we will not truly achieve conservation until destructive uses of the land are punished by social ostracism. We're a long way from realizing Leopold's vision. Again, many have criticized the model for perceived focus on gain. As mentioned, funding has restricted state-based application, and initiatives to secure broad-based funding should result in greater tax inclusivity. Additionally, many of the strongest advocates for wildlife conservation have come directly from the hunting community. Hopefully, the same vested interest hunters have shown historically in wildlife conservation will grow among the non-hunting public and result in broad support for funding. While not a criticism of the model per se, many have criticized how wildlife are governed in states. Most states have a politically appointed board or commission to oversee wildlife conservation. Power and authority varies among states. These bodies are in effect the trustees whose responsibilities are to ensure conservation of wildlife for the benefit of current and future generations. Yet actions of trustees are focused purely on the roughly 6% of Americans and Canadians who hunt. Then a conservation institution will lose relevancy for the broader public. In 2016, governance principles for wildlife conservation in the 21st century were published. And there's a link on the slide. Adoption of these principles will greatly enhance relevancy and help to ensure the future integrity of what the model's principles represent. Moving forward, I believe it is fruitless to devote energy to revisiting or revising the model. It is a concept, after all, not a dictate. It's not law. The principles that are embodied in it, many are embedded in law, many in broad-based policy. I firmly believe that our best use of our collective energies are seeking legal and policy initiatives that will help us meet the emerging threats to wildlife conservation. I think that's the path forward for the future. And that's really where we should be focusing our collective efforts. And
So, Chair, that concludes that part. Unfortunately, Dr. Irving wasn't available for questions. I believe that Chris Smith, who's on our agenda later, could address some questions if anyone has any particular ones. But I think that was a very good summary of the North American model and the concepts behind it.
I found it very interesting and very timely with everything that the commission has been undertaking. I cannot say thank you enough to the department for identifying this particular video and presenting it. It is just remarkable, again, with the timing. So many of the principles that he talked about, as you saw, I took copious notes and I was very engaged, focused on what he was saying. These concepts are pretty much the thread, the fabric of what we're doing on the commission. And well, not only the commission, more importantly, the department and the public. Everybody that comes here, not only today, but of all our meetings and everything that we are doing in New Mexico is just spot on. So that's what just really, energized me when listening to this. Vice Chair, I see you're smiling and you want to say something too.
I do. I actually wanted to ask the director if we could get copies of the slides, if that's an option, at least the first one that had the articles that you recommended for reading. I think particularly now with RAWA coming and, some of the legislation we've seen brought forward over the last couple of years with some of the legislators, I think it could inform not only the actions that this commission takes, but also the actions they take. And I think, helping them get a little more background and information on this kind of model could be really, really helpful.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Archuleta, that video is actually available on YouTube. So we can
Oh,
use that
spectacular.
link and then we can see if we can dredge up the slides from Dr. Irving.
And
I'm
if
sure
it's
you'll
just-
have the link.
If it's online, that's perfect. I can just grab a screenshot of the suggested reading.
Commissioners, Fulford or Lopez, any comments, questions? I know we didn't want to have public comment, and we will take a break. But we do have presenters that are online, and I would love to hear from them. I see, is that Chris Smith?
That's
Who's that?
Sean.
It's Sean.
He's the next agenda item, Madam
Johnson.
Chair.
Okay,
We just brought him in early.
Yes.
Did he want to say something?
Madam Chair, I think he's just ready to present whenever we are.
Oh, very good. Okay, well, in that case, can we take a break? It's 10 o'clock and I want to stick to my word. But again, I want to try and get through this morning's presentation meeting. So how about 5 minutes? Would 5 minutes be enough time?
Yes, depending on how long.
Okay.
Can we do 10 just to?
10 in case we can, right, look, okay, so we'll make it 10 o'clock, yeah, thank you, appreciate you for your patience, okay. Recess, 5-10 minutes. Commissioners, Director, Department, Public, what a wonderful presentation and what a wonderful break we just had. Wow, some really good discussions. Director, I'm looking forward to this next action item. Actually, it's not really an action item. No.
It says action.
It
but
says
there's not-
action
It's not
item.
our action.
Recovering America's Wildlife Act, RAWA, a good overview presentation. We're looking forward to it. So thank you.
Madam Chair, I'd like to introduce Sean Seville. He works for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and has been leading the charge for the association on the Recovering America's Wildlife Act lobbying and trying to make sure that all the states are connected and understand how best to help us achieve our goals. With that, Sean, maybe you could let us know a little bit about yourself before you start your presentation.
Sure, thanks. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. And we can
Excellent.
see. Great. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me, members of the commission and Director Sloan. Appreciate the opportunity to present to you today on the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And it's been great working with the whole New Mexico team, Jenny, Matt, Tristana, the whole crew. You've got a great staff there, and I appreciate all the great work that you guys are doing. And, just by way of quick introduction on myself, I am Sean Seville, work with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the manager of the Alliance for America's Fish and Wildlife campaign, which of course is designed to pass the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, coalition of over 1,000 willing and supportive businesses and organizations lined up behind us to help see this through and work on implementation too on the ground. Once we get the funding passed, obviously there's going to be a lot of work to do to implement this big piece of legislation. So look forward to working with you all on that too. I have a special place in my heart for the great state of New Mexico. Worked and lived in Albuquerque in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's where I met Martin Heinrich. Was a neighbor of mine and a co-worker. I met him before he began his elected career, even before he was a member of the city council there in Albuquerque. And like I said, he was a neighbor of mine and a friend, and it's been great to see him progress through the many elected offices he has held, and now as a United States Senator for the great state of New Mexico. It's been great to see him take a leadership role, leading the charge on the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and we certainly appreciate working with him and his staff as well. So have a lot of love for the state and the wild places that are there, and all the special species that the Recovering America's Wildlife Act would help with its funding out on the ground. So with that, happy to give you a little bit of a status update on the legislation, a little bit of background on some of the things that I think are going to be important, especially to New Mexico, and then happy to take any questions as you see fit or as time allows. So unless anybody has anything else to say right up front, I'll jump into it.
That'd be great.
Thank you. And again, thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. So, the bill passed the House, as folks probably know, with a bipartisan vote, 231 to 190 back in June. It has also gone through Senate committee action. Environment Public Works Committee was passed out of that committee as well earlier this year, and with a bipartisan vote. And so now it currently awaits Senate action. Once it passed the House, kicked it over to the Senate, and we feel like we're in a good position for Senate floor action as early as mid-September. Once they come back from recess, the week of the 12th, we feel like it's likely that we will see a vote, as early as mid to late September, potentially early October. And of course, your two senators are supporters of the bill, as are two out of the three of your House representatives, are co-sponsors on the bill, and appreciate all that support. Almost 200 House co-sponsors, 42 bipartisan co-sponsors on the Senate bill. That's nearly half of the Senate are co-sponsors at this point on the bill, and for a piece of conservation legislation, that's fairly unprecedented. So we feel like we're in a really good position to see widespread Senate support coming up in September. I think, you know, a lot of the conversations at this point have really focused on sort of checking the boxes, making sure all the politics are lining up. And, you know, the one sort of big outstanding piece that was sort of front and center in some of the debate in the House was the offset or pay for the legislation. And I know Senators Heinrich and Blunt, his Republican counterpart from Missouri, have been working really hard with the leadership in both the Senate and the House to finalize a pay for option. We think that there is an option that they have been pursuing that we will see finalized in legislative text prior to hitting the floor in September. And that option would offset the entire price tag of the bill. So they typically go with the Congressional Budget Office does like a 10-year window scoring of the bill. And so the bill would score about $14 billion over that 10-year time horizon. And this offset option would provide somewhere in the neighborhood of about $16 billion. So it would offset the entire price tag plus some, which would obviously go a long way towards you know, balancing the budget, alleviating some of the concerns that we've heard from specifically some of the fiscal conservative members of Congress, and certainly would position it well for widespread bipartisan support and a bipartisan vote in the Senate. So look forward to seeing that coming to fruition here shortly. And I think that's going to be the sort of final hurdle to overcome before we could see swift action back in September. A lot of great work happening right now in the states across the board to keep the drumbeat up, make touches to key Senate offices, specifically making sure that all the co-sponsors are lined up, addressing any outstanding concerns. I know a lot of state agencies are doing field tours, trying to get members of Congress and senators out to see the great projects that they're working on the ground, how the Recovering America's Wildlife Act funding would benefit their states and their priority projects from their state wildlife action plans. Doing some media. There's been some really good high visibility media recently in markets like the Washington Post and on Vox, online news sources, and we'll see a bunch over the next couple of weeks here with a lot of those field tours happening. So really appreciate all the great work that the states are doing right now to keep that drumbeat up during the August recess and make sure that we're well positioned for a Senate vote here when they come back in September. You know, as you know, the Southwick study from last year that you worked on with the Southwick team, you know, indicates strong public support for increased funding for wildlife conservation in the state of New Mexico, i.e. Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and highlights a variety of really solid options for providing match to that $27 million that you might see from the legislation, and, you know, other sources of funding for the agency to leverage, including, you know, the gross receipts tax, oil and gas receipts options, outdoor stamp, et cetera. Some really good solid options that the report highlighted. It was great to see the level of detail there that the Southwick team was able to provide. So nice to see that. Hope folks have been able to utilize that to you know, keep support high. And it looks like, you know, obviously you'll see your constituents supporting this as we see more legislative action come up here quickly. There's a lot of work happening as well in the states and across the country in terms of becoming RAWA ready. You know, there was, I think when the bill passed the House, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service goes into sort of the next phase of planning, and the bill is now what's deemed imminent in terms of ability to pass the Congress. So that kicks things into high gear in terms of their planning efforts. You know, they've started an executive leadership team. The charter is out for that. There are a handful, I think a half a dozen state directors from agencies that have been selected to participate on that, as well as Director Williams and others on that executive leadership team. There are a couple interim task force teams that have been put in place to help the wildlife sport fish restoration policy division work through the policies and guidelines that are going to be necessary to implementing this big piece of legislation once it's passed. So we're feeling good about that. Appreciate the leadership coming from the service and the states, of course, to plan for how this money will be spent on the ground. I know, New Mexico is one of, I think, 28 or so states that prepared a really nice one-pager that highlighted some of the projects from your state wildlife action plan that will be prioritized for implementation once the funding is available to states. And, I think that has really helped partners see themselves in this, has really helped to facilitate some productive conversations with the tribes and with other stakeholders, important stakeholders in the state and across the country. And, that helps us too to be able to speak to some of those projects as we make connections with Senate offices and members of the House. We can really speak to how this funding will help achieve your conservation objectives on the ground and the partnerships that are standing by ready to help implement this once we can get the bill passed. So that has been really helpful. And again, I just want to emphasize that the partnerships are really the key to success of this legislation, from advocacy to education to law enforcement to all of the different components of the work that will be funded through this historic piece of legislation. You've got great partnerships there on the ground. States have been sort of the key conduits and conveners for all the stakeholders around wildlife conservation. And I think we'll see a lot more folks coming out of the woodwork to help once we get right there, sort of at the finish line, ready to get this thing done. So I look forward to working with folks on those shovel-ready projects and demonstrating the existing partnerships and plans that just need an infusion of capital to get things really kicked off and running here. And it's helped kick off that match conversation too. Obviously, there's going to be a 25% non-federal match component that states will be responsible for coming up with. That's certainly no small amount of money, but partnerships will be the key to that as well. Will help states further engage and invest partners and stakeholders and entities like the tribes and pueblos there in New Mexico to help implement this on the ground and bring that match to the table. So that'll be great to see. And there are a handful of really sort of timely and relevant discussions happening about things like water shortages, drought, wildfire, habitat resiliency. Especially in the West, those are key topics of conversation in a lot of different forums, as you well know. And we have developed some talking points and some guidance to help address and answer some questions about how the Recovering America's Wildlife Act could help address some of those key challenges for the West. And I think there've been some good conversations recently about the Inflation Reduction Act that just passed the Congress and was signed into law. Going to be some money flowing to the states from that to help address some of these challenges as well, and also some opportunities to help potentially provide some additional match dollars to the states from some of those pieces. So a lot of good things happening right now. Look forward to getting this thing done. I think we're poised for swift Senate action in September, and look forward to working with you all to get this thing across the finish line as quickly as possible and get that money out on the ground. So we can implement these state wildlife action plans that are ready to go. So happy to wrap up there and see if anybody has questions that I can help answer.
Wow. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you again for coming today. Saturday, and not many people come in for a meeting on Saturday, so thank you. Also, this is awesome work that you, the Senators Heinrich and Blunt are doing. Keep up the good work. Very appreciative. I know New Mexico, our governor, our state, our senators and representatives are looking forward to a good outcome. We're very positive. The commission and the department, the staff have been preparing for a very positive result. We know it's going to happen in September, hopefully September, maybe October. We have a very strong partnership. We believe in collaboration. I think the people here today, online, present, the department and the staff, we love partnerships, collaboration. I think it is part of our culture. And Sean, it's great to know that you were here in Albuquerque. It's like, oh my gosh. And I'm sorry, I don't know your background, but hopefully offline someday I'll get to meet you. So I do have a question, and I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer, okay? Because again, I have a lot of hope and excitement and belief it's going to happen. For those that don't believe and are not, maybe on the same page with us about RAWA, I see jobs. I see the money and how it's going to be spent, wildlife, conservation, game and fish. It's a beautiful outcome. But my Debbie Downer question is, I hate to even ask. You talk about a plan A. What is the plan B? Okay. Doggone it. We always have to think about those unintended consequences. So what happens if it's not an outcome that we want in October? Then what? How can we keep some of the steam in the engine here?
You mean in terms of getting the legislation passed?
Yes, sir.
Well, I've been working personally on this for 6 years. This is the 4th Congress that the legislation has been introduced into, right? So, you got to go through that 2-year window every Congress to try to get it done. And each year it's gone a little further, gained a little more headway, a little more momentum, and a little more public support. So I think, we've got the sort of stars alignment happening right now. A lot of bipartisan support, a lot of good leadership buy-in. The President Biden's already said he'll sign it if they send it to his desk. So that there's administration support for it. So, I'm confident that we're going to get this thing done. But to your point, plan B, if it doesn't happen this year, we're going to keep pushing. And, there are some fail safes. You still have the state and tribal wildlife grant program that's providing some funding, although, less than 5% of what's needed to implement your plans, of course, right? So that's why we need this legislation passed. But you've got that, you've got some other sources of funding that we can rely on in the interim. And, we're going to do this thing one way or another, whether it takes, 10 years or 15 years to get it done. It's been decades in the making. As you know, it's gone through several iterations over the course of the last 20, 25 years. And I've been a part of several of those previous iterations, not in this official role, but in other organizations and other roles. So I'm confident that this is it's gonna get done.
Awesome. I like that answer. Thank you. Vice Chair, you have a comment?
Actually, a couple of questions, if you don't mind, Sean.
Sure.
So, and I'm going to get a little bit in the weeds for you. So, just question on the 42 co-sponsors. Is that a bipartisan co-sponsor? Obviously, the lead sponsors are, but I'm curious about what your breakdown is of the 42.
Yeah, 16 Republicans there, and the remainder are Democrats. For a while there, Senators Heinrich and Blunt have been managing the sort of onboarding of co-sponsors one-to-one to make sure that they're really, maintaining the bipartisan spirit of the legislation. I think, prior or just following the House vote, leadership felt like it was important to try to get some of the Democratic leadership on the bill. I think we're still working to get some additional Republican co-sponsors, and we may see some just prior to the vote that's coming up here in September, October. But still having 16 Republican co-sponsors on the bill is pretty impressive. And we've been able to onboard some of the Democratic leadership on the bill recently in the last several weeks as well. So we're really excited to work with Senators Heinrich and Blunt, and they're both really personally invested in getting this thing across the finish line. And this is really a legacy issue for Senator Blunt, especially. He's retiring after this Congress, and really wants to see this done for future generations, and to sort of seal his conservation legacy on this.
Yeah, great legacy legislation. My other question is, as always, pay-fors are the tricky piece, right?
Sure.
Having seen up close and way too personal the IRA go through, I do a lot of work in DC, so I'm back and forth, but I'm curious if you know what they're looking at for pay-fors.
Well, you'll know this as well as anybody else. The first rule of pay-fors is you don't talk about the pay-for. Because if you do, next thing you know, somebody's opposed to that pay-for, or somebody's going to snag it out from underneath you.
Yeah.
So, we were able to protect the pay-for from being used in the reconciliation process and in the IRA's passage. So we felt confident about that. And it's one of Senator Heinrich and Blunt's most closely guarded secrets at this point. But I can say that it is under the jurisdiction of the Senate Finance Committee, and that it has been blessed by the chair and ranking member of that committee.
Excellent. That's great. And hopefully there's support from the majority leader. And it'd be great if you had minority leader support as well. Those are two key.
Yeah, that's sort of the exercise right now, is checking those boxes.
Yeah, well done keeping those pay-fors out of IRA, and is there a chance that this would get attached to an omnibus at the end of the year too?
I think that's the plan B if it doesn't see a standalone vote in September. There'll be a lot of those big packages coming together in the lame duck that I think this is well positioned to be included in as well if it doesn't see a standalone vote.
Excellent. Thanks. Well, listen, thank you for everything you've done, especially not giving up over the last 6 years. That's excellent to keep pursuing that, and clearly gaining an incredible amount of momentum. So well done. And thank you for everything you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, it's a labor of love. Honored to do it.
Sorry, one more quick question. Is there anything we can do to be helpful?
I think just the more inevitable this seems, the better off we are, right? So if we can characterize this as something that is just waiting to be done, and so critically needed on the ground to facilitate all the great work that we know we can do, and we have the existing partnerships and the frameworks ready to go, we just need to get it across the finish line. So just maintaining that strong public support, making sure stakeholders are engaged, making sure everybody's educated up to speed on what they can do, and then supporting, your great champion, Senator Heinrich, to get this thing done. He deserves a lot of credit for his leadership on this. So giving him the cover and the support that he needs to get it done will be helpful.
Super. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
Commissioners, Walter Lopez. Director, would you like to say something?
Madam Chair, not really. I mean, I know that John and Aqua have done a great job really keeping everybody focused on it, building that 1,000+ partnership. And it is, as John mentioned, it's a generational opportunity that with double the size of our agency, we'll need to find the state match. I think that's our next big challenge, right? Once it passes, is making sure that our folks within the state that are the decision makers understand the significance of it and are able to find a way to get us that match so we can access those federal funds and begin to really make a difference on the ground.
Right.
And then I'd like to thank Sean for taking some time out of his Saturday to visit with us.
Absolutely.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
Well, do you have any questions for us?
Well, I guess, the one question I have is about sort of process. Do you So will you have the spending authority to implement the funding once it's passed? I know a lot of states, I'm not as well versed in the state legislative efforts. I know a lot of states have to go through a separate sort of resolution process or an authorization process at the state legislative level to get the budgetary authority to spend the money. And I just wasn't clear on how that works in New Mexico.
So Madam Chair, Sean, I think the answer to your question is yes, I think we have the authority. The issue will be, we won't have it if we don't have the match. And obviously we won't be able to access it if we don't have the match. So as long as we can come up with match that's suitable, we have the authority. It may not be built into our budget, but because it's considered 100% federal money, we can go through a budget adjustment request with BAR and bring it in as 100% federal money, and the state is always happy to have us bring in some extra cash.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
We've been taking action. I mean, in fact, we have a person here in the audience, an HR representative that's been working with the department. The department themselves have been working with the budget, with everybody else in preparing since last year for this to happen. So I think that's a resounding yes to your answer. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, that helps a lot.
Good. All right. Well, let us take another break, just a 5-minute one, if we could. I'm going to keep to my word on our agenda. And Sean, hopefully we'll see you back here in New Mexico sometime soon.
I'd love to come visit.
Okay, great. Take care.
Thank
All
you.
right. This meeting is in recess for about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yes.
Commissioners, department, members of the public, I think we have our next speaker, Chris Smith. He will be here from Wildlife Management Institute. Good morning. It's nice to see you, Chris Smith.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely. Good morning. It is a great morning. We want to hear about this update on Wildlife Management Institute's Commission guidebook. I know it's a 200-page document, I think, and we'd like to understand, and not we're going to get through all 200 pages here today. But we are interested in, generally speaking, the state commission role in strategic partnership with an agency director and stakeholders, and everything you want to tell us.
Okay, thank you. My first question, I guess, is can you see the slide deck that I prepared?
Yes.
Okay. There we go. All right. So first of all, I want to thank you, Madam Chair, members of the commission, and Director Sloan for inviting me to talk with you today about this project. Just as a little background about me, I spent 23 years with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, been 13 years as Deputy Director for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and about a dozen years now with the Wildlife Management Institute. And throughout all that time, I've worked closely with state boards and commissions like yours, which has given me both a understanding of the challenges that you face and profound respect and appreciation for the job that you do representing the citizens of your state and making really tough decisions on behalf of the people and the resources that your agency manages. The project that I'm going to talk about today, or the work that we were doing, and I've been joined in this effort by my colleague Ann Forstchen, who is also on the meeting today, is to update the commission guidebook, the 200-page document that you referred to, Madam Chair, that was last updated in 2007. And our goal through this project has been to try to streamline that document, make it a little more useful, and to develop some additional materials, including a webinar, which will hopefully be similar to this presentation, that will be useful to agencies. And I appreciate the invitation from Director Sloan and yourself to use you as sort of guinea pigs and run this by you. So I think the presentation that I'm going to make today will link very well with the video that we saw earlier from Dr. Organ, where he talked about the North American model. The model provides some good information on desired outcomes of management, but in some respects, it doesn't necessarily provide guidance on how to achieve those outcomes. And just to give you a quick example, one of the tenets that Dr. Organ described was wildlife can only be killed for legitimate purposes. And of course, everybody has their own idea as to what constitutes legitimate purposes. And in your role as commissioners, you will undoubtedly face challenges to or questions regarding what are legitimate uses of wildlife or legitimate ways of taking wildlife in New Mexico. So hopefully what we can focus on today is a little bit more on the process or processes that you can use to achieve the outcomes that are defined in the model. If we could go to the next slide, I'll just give you a brief overview of what I want to talk about today. Just very briefly touch on the history of conservation in North America and origins of the commission system, just to provide some context, and then talk a bit about commission authorities and roles, get into more depth on public trust responsibilities and ways that you as a commission can conduct your governance in order to be as effective as you possibly can. And feel free to ask questions at any point as we go through this. In terms of the history of wildlife conservation in North America, prior to European colonization, the indigenous populations had relatively limited impacts on either the habitat or the wildlife. But in the centuries following European colonization, associated with the unregulated exploitation of the land, there were tremendous changes to habitat. Many species were decimated. And it wasn't until really in the late 1800s or early 1900s that a number of influential conservation leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, and Harriet Hemingway recognized that the course that the North America was on was unsustainable and began pressing for conservation. And that really formed the basis of the conservation movement in North America. Started out primarily focused on protecting populations that were left. And then in the mid portion of the last century, we really developed the science-based management capacity that could be used to restore habitats, restore populations. And as populations recovered and people had more ways or more opportunities to use wildlife, there were increasing conflicts in terms of how populations could or should be used. And those the people that were interested in using wildlife turned to the political process to try to influence those decisions. And that led to a number of conflicts that resulted eventually in development of the commission form of governance that you all participate in. So we could go to the next slide. To provide just a little bit of background on why commissions were established in the early to middle part of the last century, people were seeing undue partisan political influence in wildlife decision-making. Now, clearly the decisions that you make are political decisions. They are public policy decisions. But in an effort to limit the influence of partisanship in that process, the International Association of Game and Fish Commissioners back in the 1930s developed this concept of establishing citizen commissions. And the idea was that the commissioners would be insulated to some degree from electoral politics and through using an appointment process, and creating commissions and giving them the power to be making wildlife management decisions would provide a more effective way for public engagement in decision-making, provide for better stewardship and sustainable use of the resources, and it would also provide a way for the citizens to have some oversight on their wildlife agencies. In effect, creating a board of directors for their state wildlife agencies. And by delegating many of the responsibilities for wildlife management from the legislature to the commission, it provides an opportunity for more deliberative approaches to some of the complex and challenging decisions that commissions face. If I could go to the next slide. So in most states, the commission or board is established by statute. There are a few states where a commission is established in the Constitution, but by and large, they're established by statute. The size varies from as few as 5 to as many as 19. And in most cases, commissioners are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the legislature, which provides a series of checks and balances with respect to the makeup of the commissions. Some states specify qualifications for commissioners, such as requiring that they have a knowledge of fish and wildlife, or that they have particular backgrounds such as farming or ranching and so forth. And we view those as means to ensure that certain interests are represented on the commission. But I think it's important for all commissioners to recognize and remember that you are responsible to and should be responsive to all of the citizens of the state in your role as trustees of their wildlife resources. So in terms of commission authorities, those also vary widely from state to state. In most cases, commissions do have authority for setting seasons, bag limits, or making other rules. For example, with respect to wildlife management areas or other state-owned property, setting fish and wildlife management policy, in some cases setting the budget or providing fiscal oversight, hiring and overseeing the director. And in all cases, commissions have to comply with various administrative procedures such as sunshine laws. And because those vary so widely from state to state, we don't get into the individual details of those. Rather, refer you to discussion with the director or your legal staff to provide input on the specifics within your state. Next slide, please. But I want to emphasize that regardless of what your specific authorities are within your state, the commission really has two essential roles. And I like to cast these as managing the trust assets of fish and wildlife in your states based on the ancient philosophy and or legal doctrine that Dr. Organ described, the public trust doctrine, and also managing the trust that the public has in the commission and the agency, which I think is a modern imperative. Public trust, and I'll return to this at the end of the presentation. Trust in the agency and trust in the commission is really important to your success and effectiveness as an organization. Next slide. So just to touch briefly, and I'll just skim over this because John did a great job in his video of talking in depth about the public trust doctrine. The public trust doctrine is a legal doctrine, which, as John said, is derived from Roman and English common law, and it is enforceable by the courts. Now, the nature of the public trust doctrine and the degree to which it applies to various states differs because it is state-based, and in many cases, it is case law rather than statutory law. But the public trust doctrine rests on this broader philosophy of public trust thinking that includes concepts such as human well-being depends on nature, certain resources such as fish, wildlife, air, and water are not suitable for private ownership. All citizens deserve equal rights or have equal rights to benefits derived from nature, and that government is publicly accountable for how they administer and manage the trust. And importantly, regardless of the nature of the public trust doctrine within any given state, this underlying philosophy is enforceable at the ballot box. So if an agency or a commission is not operating in a manner that is consistent with, sufficiently aligned with the interests of the public within their state, they have recourse through either electing new representatives who will appoint different commissioners, or in states where the citizens can initiate laws through citizen initiative. That's another way that they can use the ballot box as a way to hold government accountable. Next slide, please. So there are four key elements in the trust system or the public trust management system. You think about it similar to a trust you might establish for your children or your heirs in the event of an untimely passing. There are assets, beneficiaries, and then managers and trustees in wildlife, just as there are in a private trust you might set up. The assets obviously are the fish and wildlife resources within the state. When you think about beneficiaries, oftentimes hunters and anglers are the first sort of beneficiaries that come to mind with respect to the work of a state wildlife commission. But really, the beneficiaries are much broader than that. You think about landowners, agriculture producers who may be affected by or benefit from the decisions that you make with respect to population size, management of predator populations, and so forth. They are clearly beneficiaries, whether they are actively involved in hunting and fishing or not. And in addition, anyone who has an interest in or values wildlife, as well as future generations, are also beneficiaries of the Wildlife Trust and are folks to whom, as trustees, you have some responsibility. When we talk about administration of the trust managers, and this is a concept that I developed in a paper I published back in 2011 to try to clarify the role of state wildlife professionals versus the elected and appointed officials like yourself, who have the responsibility for making the decisions that most impact those trust resources and allocate the benefits. Trust managers are the folks who work within the agency, and they have specific ministerial roles and administrative roles, which are quite different from those that you have as trustees, both at the level of the commission and the elected officials in the legislature. So I'd like to talk a little bit more in detail about those with the next slide. So when we think about the responsibilities of the trust managers, those folks that work for you, obviously one of their most important responsibilities is monitoring the status of the trust assets, conducting the survey work that they do, conducting research and so forth, that allow them to identify the potential benefits of the trust. Often those are articulated through management plans that may have a variety of options, and they can bring those forward both to you as trustees and to the beneficiaries to inform you of what your options are and what the limitations are. And that's an incredibly important role for your staff, is in informing you of what those options are. They can also be very important and helpful in informing you as trustees about the beneficiaries' interests. And state agencies have increasingly developed capacity in social science and other human dimensions that helps inform your decisions. A vital role that your staff can play, particularly on complex issues, is facilitating dialogue among beneficiaries. In the course of my career, I've seen many instances where competing interests came to a commission and put you in the decision of making win-lose decisions, having to pick a winner and make someone else a loser. Oftentimes those decisions are not stable. They're challenged as soon as they're made. If you can have a process that brings those competing interests together outside of the direct decision-making that you have and facilitate dialogue among those competing interests that allows them to find common ground and bring potential solutions that are win-win solutions to you, that can be an incredibly valuable service of your staff. And I'd encourage you to take advantage of that whenever you can. Obviously, your staff should be making science-informed recommendations to you and then managing the trust as directed by you. And it's important for staff to follow the direction that's provided by the trustees. Next slide. In terms of your responsibilities as commissioners, obviously maintaining the corpus of the trust and ensuring the sustainability of the populations is paramount. You need to consider the needs of all of the beneficiaries, both current and future generations, in your decision-making, and allocate benefits of the trust. Now, there are two important caveats with respect to allocating the benefits. One of those, obviously, is that has to be consistent with the capacity of the trust. And it also has to be in consideration of competing interests. And you clearly will not be able to satisfy everybody in every decision that you make, but the more you can demonstrate your consideration of those competing interests, the more likely you are to be successful in having those decisions implemented. And by focusing at the level of policy and regulatory matters and letting the director handle the day-to-day administrative work of the agency, you can use your time most effectively. Next slide, please. In terms of the kinds of information that should come to you and inform your decisions, there are really 5 primary areas that will influence your decisions. Obviously, there's biological and ecological information that comes to you that informs you of the capacity of populations to sustain harvest or just to deal with the impacts of climate change or habitat alterations. There's information on the technical feasibility. For example, your staff may only be able to obtain a certain level of accuracy in their surveys simply based on what's technically possible for them. Economic feasibility is another factor to be considered. The agency has a limited budget, and in order to implement your decisions, obviously it's going to have the resources to do that. Legal mandates and constraints will influence your decisions. And finally, social values and interests have a huge impact on commission decisions. And that's another reason why state agencies have increasingly turned to social science, human dimensions research to help inform them of what the social values and interests are, in addition to the requirements of your public meeting process and other ways of gathering public input. Next slide, please. So why is your job so hard? Well, when you I think a large part of it is, and my information officer back in Fairbanks at one point told me that I should be happy that there's so much controversy associated with wildlife, because it means that everybody cares. And if only a few people cared about wildlife, your job would be much easier. You could just satisfy them. But then you wouldn't have the broad interest and support for conservation that is really needed. But human values are changing, social values are changing associated with wildlife. We're seeing with increasing urbanization, a transition from people, the majority of people who held more traditional utilitarian values toward wildlife, toward having more pluralistic or mutualistic values, meaning that they see wildlife as members of the community that should be treated equally with people. And the competing interests, and in recent years, the decreasing civility of public policy making and politics in general has really, really made your job in the role of commissioners challenging. Next slide, please. So how can you as commissioners operate most effectively in that environment? Our recommendation would be that, first of all, you do your best job you can of inviting all perspectives to the table, being as inclusive as possible and allowing all interests to be represented. Treating all perspectives equitably. I heard a great quote the other day on a podcast, which is a really interesting podcast. It's called Conversations with People Who Hate Me, if you're interested in that. But the individual who produces that podcast said, empathy does not imply endorsement. You can be empathetic to and understand all varieties of perspectives without necessarily endorsing them. Respecting individuals regardless of their position, in my experience, has often been reflected in respect back to the commission. Seeking to fully understand issues is really important. As I said, there are five primary sources of information that should be coming to you with respect to your decisions. And the more opportunity you have to understand all the aspects of that issue, the better your decisions will be. Obviously, you need to consider both the short and long-term impacts of your decisions and weigh the trade-offs between those. Acting and speaking as one body is really important to commissions. You will certainly have rigorous debate, and that's to be encouraged. There are a wide variety of interests that need to be represented and considered. But when you reach the point of making a decision, it's really important for the commission to act and speak as one body in explaining that decision, and avoid ascribing blame to one member or a minority, or speaking ill of each other. That will undermine your credibility faster than anything else. And then finally, being accountable for your decisions, and following through when you make a decision, making sure that the agency follows through in implementation, being willing to listen to feedback, and if the decision turns out not to have the consequences or outcome that you expected, being willing to reconsider that, and take corrective action as needed. Next slide, please. The last thing I wanted to touch on was the importance, as I said, of managing the public's trust in you as a commission and in the agency. And it's no secret that public trust in government has been declining over the last 50 years. Particularly in the last few years, we've seen a tremendous erosion in trust in government. And that has really made it difficult for agencies to operate. Public trust in you and the way you and the agency work is incredibly important. With public trust, you can accomplish great things. Without it, your job becomes much more difficult. It's easy to lose it, and it's really hard to regain it. So the keys to maintaining public trust in your process is honesty, openness, fairness with all interests, and being reliable, meeting the expectations. If you set a course to make a certain decision or to take an action, following through on that can be incredibly important. As Dr. Organ mentioned toward the end of his presentation, John and Ann and I and many others worked over a course of a few years to develop a set of wildlife governance principles. And we go into some detail as to what those principles are and how they can be applied to promote this sort of good governance that will help you be effective. And those are summarized in the commission guidebook. So if we can go to the next slide. Just to give you an update on that. As I mentioned, you guys are getting a little bit of a preview. Our goal is to have the updated guidebook ready for the September meeting of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is just about exactly a month from now. We'll have that document, a recorded webinar, and some other materials available for use by agencies and commissions at that time. And all of those materials will be produced in electronic form. There won't be any more 200-pound books or 200-page books you have to pack around with you. It's all going to be online, electronic resources moving into the modern era. So with that, Madam Chair, I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have of me, either about commission governance, the guidebook and resources we're working on, or the North American model. If there are any lingering questions about that. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Chris. This morning has been awesome. And you're one of our last speakers and it's just wonderful. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Just wrapping up, let me see if I can be brief with my questions. Or maybe some of them are comments. So the first one is something that you said about legitimate purpose, the killing for legitimate purpose. We do have that crop up so many times in our rulemaking discussions, in our meetings, and also offline. All those various beneficiaries are looking for, and I'm going to use the term, I didn't hear you use it, balance. So for example, a balancing of interests, a cattleman or a farmer, they have cattle, they have farm animals to protect. We've got this Mexican gray wolf, and somebody's calling it an endangered species, but I got to protect my land. I got to protect my animals, my interests, my family, my kids. And so a lot of time there is some balancing of interests. So that's just a comment for me. The public doctrine, public trust doctrine is so wonderful because, again, somewhat of a balancing thing. Equal rights, we heard yesterday from someone speaking at our meeting, and that equality that we often look for. So I'm just going to say it's all over the place. Now my question, when we talk about our as trustees, our persons that we are listening to, I'm from this district, or I'm with this background, or I'm with this expertise. Our statute asks us to come with, but the question is, what should we call those persons? Sometimes people will use the term constituents, but we're not elected officials. Good morning, Commissioner Salazar Henry. She's online. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I think she's been here, but okay, thank you. So my question is, how often, what should we just use the term beneficiary instead of constituents? I come from a management background, at mid-level, senior level type background. And I tend to use the term customers, stakeholders, users. So what would the commission guidebook use? Should we just stick with beneficiaries?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. We in the guidebook, we've predominantly used the term stakeholder. Okay. And by definition, the way we use that term is that a stakeholder is anyone who is affected by a decision of the commission or who has the ability to affect or influence a decision of the commission. In the broadest sense, since virtually all citizens to some extent could be affected by a decision, that could be used interchangeably with beneficiaries. Stakeholders is the most commonly used term. So.
Okay, thank you, sir. And sometimes I often look to wildlife and their habitat as beneficiaries, and I don't know if that's a little odd. You call them assets, but I often think of them as another voice that aren't talking, but we rely on those managers, those experts who give us data, or the public give us data about them. And so that's just another comment. Last thing I'm going to a comment on, and then I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of babbling today. Normally I do a lot of babbling. The last comment that I have, why is our job so hard? And I'm going to be very direct, okay? And actually, I'm going to be a little bit personal. And I know this meeting is recorded, and that's great. That's wonderful. We have people here in the audience and the staff and the commission. Personally speaking, I like to give. That is a very key part of my person. I like to give, and I like to help others. The challenge sometimes is that sometimes no good deed goes unpunished. And in helping others, sometimes we are challenged legally, and we don't expect to be sued in our personal capacity. We don't expect to be harassed. Doesn't happen very often, knock on wood, that we get challenged. We've even had threats early on in my tenure here. The other challenge, I think, not enough hours in the day. I want to listen to everybody. I want to hear from everybody. Everybody else I consider every person the expert. And I just don't have enough hours in the day to balance everything. I want to do a good job. And I think that's that's a challenge for me. And then the other final concept, boy, am I really being personal here. This concept of the trust manager as a commissioner, i.e. the trustee, a role is not the manager. We're not managing the department or the trustee manager, but we have an oversight responsibility. And sometimes people look to us to direct, but yet we're all kind of on the same team, the trustee, the trust manager, and the beneficiaries and the asset. I like your diagram because it's all connected and it's all one. So that also makes it kind of hard. But again, that was just a comment. So thank you for hearing me. Commissioners, anybody else want to throw something in or comment, question?
Actually, I just really would like to thank you. This was incredibly helpful and really, and I'm relatively new to the commission, so being able to see that oversight and really having you spell it out. And I look forward to reading the no longer 200-page book as soon as it's out of life. Thank you so much.
Director, do you want to say something?
No, I'd just like to thank Chris for coming out and giving us a test run. I really appreciate it. I think the commission will get a lot out of the interaction as we move forward. And I'm out here Saturday.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Do you have anything for us?
No, Madam Chair, just again, to thank you for giving us this opportunity. And if you do have thoughts over the next few days, feel free to shoot me an email. Any feedback is most welcome.
Absolutely, would be happy to. Okay, commissioners, department, public, we're going to take just a 5. Let's try, no, is 5 enough? Good. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute recess because we're getting close to 12 o'clock here. Thank you. And we look forward to our next topic, which is a facilitated discussion on the commission's mission, vision, and values. And we want to welcome Deb Dell Hammond. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. commission members and everyone.
I'd like to say good morning.
Good morning, just barely though.
I know.
Just barely getting that under. So we're gonna make one small change. Originally, we had designed this session to be able to kind of start a draft. Because of our shortness of time today, we're gonna have a little bit more of a conversation. So this will be a little bit more aspirational, if that works for everybody. All right? Okay. So we're going to talk about mission, supported by New Mexico statute. We're going to talk about vision. And really what that vision will be is trying to briefly imagine our legacy to New Mexico, and what a great day to be doing that after these amazing conversations today. I'm sure our heads and our hearts are just full of all the possibilities. So first, let's just get level set on the definition. We utilize the Baldrige Excellence Framework, and when I say we, it was Chairperson Salazar Hickey and myself settled on this Baldrige Framework to put in front of you today. And the definition in the context of Baldrige is the Commission's overall function. What is the Commission attempting to accomplish? What is the Commission's work? Vision, the desired future state, what you're seeking to accomplish as a commission, your intended legacy, and then last, values, the Baldrige definition. There you can see guiding principles and behaviors. But I would like to just kind of press pause on Baldrige's definitions and hear from each of you. What do you see a mission to be, and what do you see a vision to be? Just like by definition in general.
Well, I think a mission actually helps direct and guides the work that we'll be doing.
Great. What else?
I'd like to say that it is aligned within the framework of our state law, which is our policy and purpose of the State Game Commission.
Great. What else? What does mission mean to anyone else? Any other thoughts? Okay. How about vision? We called it about desired future state. So it's a lot of things to a lot of people. I want to know what it means to you. What do you imagine your vision, not the actual vision, but the definition of a vision? What have each of you experienced that to be?
So, I mean, for me, the vision is really a helpful roadmap that allows us to find solutions to issues.
Anything else?
I think it is I like the word roadmap. It's in part sustainability, looking at the past, the present, and the future. You have to build on that for sustainability. Past, present, and future.
Okay, so do we feel pretty level set?
Commissioner Salazar Henry, are you online? Is she? Oh, she is on, but we don't hear her.
Yes.
So, oh, there she is. Okay.
So you're asking about our vision?
Yes. Or
by definition. Like, what does the mission and vision mean to you?
Well, my whole focus of being part of a commission is to help develop and lay the foundation for being able to be nimble and flexible to move with the future of where wildlife management is going. So to me, it's all about foundation building so that you have that core to be able to progress and not stay stagnant.
Thank you. I'm going to move us right along to keep on our time frame. So I have this statute up for everyone to take a look at if anyone has not ever had the opportunity. And to simplify our time, I've gone ahead and parsed it into this outline with the assistance and confirmation of our director. And I'll just give you a minute to take a look at this. The idea being, as outlined in statute, that's really the fundamental mission of the commission. But I want us to kind of maybe pause to take a look at it in new light and in light of the enriched conversations that we had today. And what possibilities might we see for describing the mission, thinking forward to RAWA, and thinking forward to the broadened idea of what wildlife management will be.
I find it interesting that based on sort of the RAWA conversation and some of the other conversations, that the term game and fish kind of is narrowing. And I think the chair talked about it earlier, that there are a great number of stakeholders that we need to take into account. Both, you know, human and species, or I should just say all species, maybe a little bit broader, and that maybe the terminology of the use of the term game and fish is maybe a bit antiquated. Back to Roberta's, you know, making sure that we're broadening and being all-encompassing. So
that suggests a lot of change for this in the next iteration of the statute, possibly. What else after the inspiring conversations of the day? How might this look differently in the future?
Commissioner Salazar Henry, anything? Honestly, I did not always sit in the front of the teacher.
And honestly, I sat up front and I did a lot of talking and I don't want to take over. Quiet. I want to hear you.
It's a lot of deer in the headlights.
Everybody else, I so want to say something. No, I'm not going to. Well, Tercio. Commissioner Lopez. Oh, but you're participating.
I'm just trying to see what else we can get.
Will the commission still be focused on providing a flexible system in the future?
Absolutely.
Does it feel that development for public recreation and food supply and propagation and planting, all of those are relevant? How might those change?
I think I heard the vice chair say that the terminology, the English language tends to evolve, and we may have words that are broader than what's being used in this statute.
Would there be anything new?
It may be more expansive, but I think that really, if you look at the terminology for A and B, it is pretty inclusive. So you're not, you know, the words may change, but I think that this gets to the gist of what the commission, you know, mission really is. But there may be an attempt to change that and expand it, but I can't imagine it'll just be. It's almost more of a wordplay than anything else.
And I think I'm going to be very direct. The commission is not here to take on legislative role. We don't want to be perceived as trying to recommend changes to the statute. So that, I think that's where your questions are taking us, that we're a little uncomfortable.
I see. How do you see the mission of the commission then, now that I appreciate that?
I think the mission is defined in that statute personally. And if we had to use a very simple, condensed version of that, I would say we are protecting and managing for present and future generations of New Mexico's game and fish for public recreational use, development, and food supply. Trying to use some of those words.
Poetic, we'll have to. And when we have more time, I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to revisit this.
Okay.
So to keep us moving forward,
Actually, I think Commissioner Fulper has something. I just saw him bring his microphone to him, so that.
I would just go and make a comment, but
No.
we're moving along really well.
No.
No, the future, I just, I see it as a picture where we want to go, but sometimes the social values and the interest that people have become a weapon to use. And I think we've got to keep it, on a technical and more on economic. You got to look at those aspects instead of just looking at a social aspect of it. I think there's, the legal, the biology, the ecology, all that's got to be considered, but science has to drive things at the end of the day, and you can't run off your economic side of it, and you got to consider that. A lot of people say that, well, we don't, that's just money. We want to look past the money issue, but money still drives everything. So you've got to look at the economic side of every decision and take in the technical aspects of it. So
I can't say thank you enough, Commissioner Fulper, for what you just said. It relates to something that we often forget when we're in a political realm, and especially in a fish bowl. We come with intended consequences, and there are other unintended consequences. For example, we're coming looking for WAWA, but there are other things that are unintended and we need to think about. So that is a very beautiful statement that he just said. I'm just, yeah, you did good. Good job.
I'll move us along.
Mhm.
Let's talk about values.
I came with my homework.
Vision.
You really did. I saw your notes and I was like.
What's like that? So if the commission is able to work together and accomplish all of its good work, what will happen in the state of New Mexico? I'll kind of give everyone a sheet answer. Largest aspiration, but what will happen? What will happen in the state? What legacy will be left? What have we done to provide an adequate, flexible system for the protection of game and fish in New Mexico?
I hate seeing that put like that because, no endangered species. That's great, but it takes, that's where I was talking about a while ago. It takes everybody working together and not creating a weapon on this, just looking at the social aspect of something and creating a weapon that you've got to take in the economic and the science and all encompassing into that. And people have to work together for that. So that becomes such a weapon sometimes when you say, well, we want to create a no endangered species. That becomes a weapon to use against industry. And instead of working with industry and trying to coexist, a lot of people like to use that as a weapon in that. I don't like that part.
Commissioner, how would you feel about a healthy ecosystem?
A healthy ecosystem with everybody working together,
Yeah. How about that?
bring all parties together and they figure out a coexistent ecosystem that everybody can live within.
And maybe healthy, inclusive ecosystem?
Get into the words.
Stop it. And what is an ecosystem? Is it the life and their habitat? Because fish are in the water, birds are in the air. Big species are on the land. Are we looking at everything? What's your ecosystem?
When I say ecosystem, I mean, that's all inclusive of humans, species, all species, a healthy land environment. So you have, healthy grazing species for both, cattle and for, the herds we oversee.
Commissioner Salazar Henry, do you want to add? Anything? She's muted. Oh, she's muted.
I guess I'm just kind of confused about where the confusion is and really, but a future perspective, I guess I have a different, all wildlife has value, intrinsic value, monetary value. And when Commissioner Fulfer is talking about, we can't forget the economics surrounding shared habitat in an ecosystem. That's where the problem really gets about the mission, is because of the diverse members or beneficiaries for wildlife. And so we have to be thinking on a larger level about how to manage wildlife for all its value. And some of the value is just letting it be on the landscape and not trying to make money off that piece of the landscape. How you do that, I don't know how you do that, because you end up picking winners and losers in that game if there are two different conflicts about what the value is. But I don't think anymore that the Game and Fish Department can just manage each species. They have to manage the entire landscape and the ecosystem within there. I don't know if that answered anything.
Where I was coming from with that is, for wildlife, I'm not saying that there's not a value. I think there's huge value in wildlife. And, but I think also when you work with all the parties, they come up with a program, an existence that will work with everybody instead of just eliminating. You say, okay, we just don't want nothing but the wildlife on the land. And that becomes the norm anymore, instead of let's bring industry in and see how they can help further this program or further this wildlife, and have them both at the table talking instead of just one side at the table talking. And it becomes a weapon sometimes to just use the social value side of it and the social interest instead of bringing in the scientific side of it, the technical side of it, and the economic side of it. And I think you have to have everybody at the table. I was talking about the commissioner's decisions earlier, that you've got to look at all these. And I think even on wildlife, on endangered species, you have to look at all the industries and bring all the parties together and try to come up with a big picture instead of just a one-sided view. And I think that makes a habitat that everybody can coexist in. And I think that way you're listening to all the parties and not just saying, well, the social side of this says this. Well, let's bring them all in. Let's bring them all to the table and let everybody have input to that.
Great.
Thank you, Commissioner Salazar and Henry, and you too, Commissioner Fulfer. Commissioner Lopez, do you want to add anything?
I don't know.
No, actually, I'm gonna, it just occurred to me as I was looking this way, I realized I'm not including you, Director. Can you add something, or do you have a thought on this?
Oh, Madam Chair, I'm interested to hear what the commission really has to say.
But you're our secretary, you're a member of this, you're by statute. So that's what-
I was gonna chime in a little bit, just because I can't help myself.
Please.
I think we talked a little bit earlier about policy versus implementation and those kinds of things. And I think from my perspective, the commission's role is really to look at all of those interests out there and at a policy level, decide how they balance. And then it's up to the agency to figure out, okay, if that's the balance, how do we achieve it? How do we technically put that policy on the ground? And so, I think it's along the lines of what Commissioner Fulker is getting at, is making sure that we're looking at everybody's interests and how are those balanced. And that's not an easy job, as we discussed earlier. And you're not going to please everybody and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, that's to me, we talked a little bit about what's the vision. Ultimately, the vision is that everybody in New Mexico thinks, yeah, I can live with that balance. That they got that about right.
I like that. Okay, so what's so great about this is we've all just spoken about our value system. And so it's a perfect time to transition with all of these thoughts in mind. We're going to just do a quick exercise that will be extremely abbreviated due to time.
And that was, I was just going to say, it's 5 after 12.
Is it? Would you, do you want to just, shall we pause here and then just
Could we
bring the rest of the
pause,
conversation?
if
course.
we could skip the exercise? We have on the agenda an executive session, and that should take, it could easily take 2 hours. We don't want to be here on a Saturday for 2 hours more. So can we break now, and then commissioners, do you think we could wrap up our executive session in what?
I think we could wrap it up in an hour and 20 minutes.
Really? You think an executive session, we need an hour and 20 minutes?
Maybe less.
Okay, let's shoot for less. Because we have a staff here. I'm looking at the staff.
I think this is a great, but those were great comments, Jan, this one.
Okay, staff and the public, I don't know if they're gonna want to wait around that long, but
It may be less, but
well,
there is a lot to cover.
Madam Chair, are we going to come back and continue this discussion or come back and adjourn in a second?
I think we're going to end this discussion and go into recess. We're going to go into an executive session and then come back and adjourn for the day. And when we come back and adjourn, there won't be anything else to continue discussion. It's no actions being taken in the executive session. It's just discussion. So it's just a matter of getting back on the record and ending.
So with that, if it's okay, I would like to go ahead and let staff go. That doesn't need to be here to operate the equipment.
Okay, I think that. I think that's an excellent thing. And I want to say thank you to the members of the public. We have been here for you and you have been here for us. And it's been a wonderful day. I wish we could have more of these type of meetings. I'm sorry, but thank you. Okay, this meeting is hereby recessed.
I'm sure, I guess I forgot what to do the roll call and the motion and all that good stuff. Go into executive session.
Okay, please do. Do I need to make a motion?
Yes. You need to do a roll call vote.
And a roll call vote. Director, I hereby move, let me read this, to go into executive session to discuss pursuant to section 10-15-1, section H 8, NMSA 1978, to discuss property purchase, acquisition, or disposal, and section 10-15-1 H2 NMSA 1978 personnel matters. Okay, do I have a second on my motion?
Second.
Can we have a roll call vote?
Commissioner Salazar Henry,
Yes.
Commissioner Lopez,
Yes.
Commissioner Folker,
Yes.
Vice Chair Levin,
Yes.
Chair Salazar Hickey.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Mr. Secretary, just quickly, same link for Commissioner Salazar Henry.
I believe it's a different link.
Can you send that to her quickly? Thank you very much. That the Commissioner has always sent your way.
Okay. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks. Thank you. Can I have a statement about our executive session, Vice Chair? Do you have? I did. How about my?
What was through your books? I think it was the first time.
Can we wing it? No, it's not here. So, and I don't have my laptop. So, for the record,
There it is. There it is.
the commission had adjourned into executive session closed to the public. During the executive session, the commission discussed only those matters specified in its motion to adjourn, and it took no action as to any matter. So I think we are ready to adjourn for the day. And commissioners, I look forward to seeing you in Las Cruces, New Mexico on October 14th. I believe that's our next agenda, or our next commission meeting. And I thank you all and the department staff and the members of the public for joining us here today. So y'all have a good day and good afternoon.
And Roberta, we're looking forward to Chobis.
Thank you. Bye-bye.